Right, so imagine yourself in Whitehall. A grey January afternoon, because of course it is. This is London. The weather doesn't really do moods, just 50 shades of grey. You saw a government official walking down the street. Within moments, he will be shot in the back. The gunman will be arrested almost immediately. And yet, despite dozens of witnesses and a suspect in custody, investigators will soon discover something that makes no sense. What began as a straightforward shooting would eventually force Britain to rethink one of the most important questions in criminal law. Welcome back. One of the officials was, by every account, a thoroughly unremarkable man to look at. Which is sort of the point. He spent his days in and out of 10 Downing Street, well-dressed, briskly walking, looking every inch like a man of significance. Which, to be fair, he was. He had a routine. Same route down Whitehall, same time of day, the kind of predictable schedule that makes life easy. Right up until it doesn't. Because somebody had been watching that routine for weeks.
Daniel McNaughton was a wood-turner from Glasgow. Now, a wood-turner from Glasgow turning up in London in 1843 wasn't, on its own, suspicious. People moved to London for work all the time. New start, bigger city, bit of ambition. Except McNaughton wasn't here for work. McNaughton was here because he believed, with absolute, unshakable conviction, that he was being persecuted, followed, targeted by, and I want to be very clear that this is what he believed, the entire Tory political party. Not a person, not a rival, the party. He was convinced they'd been hounding him for years back in Glasgow, ruining his business, watching his every move, systematically destroying his life, and that it would never stop. Not unless he did something about it. So he didn't wait for them to come to him, he came to London, and he began watching the Prime Minister's residence. For weeks, McNaughton lingered near the Prime Minister's residence, watching who came and went, watching routines, watching faces. He watched well-dressed men come and go. He watched the comings and goings of important-looking people in expansive-looking coats, doing important-looking things. And at some point, he settled on a target. January 20th, 1843. Cold, grey, Whitehall, mid-afternoon. One of the government officials we talked about in the beginning walked his usual route, past the Admiralty, exactly as he had countless times before. McNaughton stepped out from behind him, pulled a pistol from his coat, fired. One shot, point blank, into his back. The sound cracked down the street. The victim staggered, but he didn't go down immediately. He was still standing, still conscious. McNaughton reached for a second pistol. And this is the only genuinely lucky moment in this entire story. A police officer nearby saw what happened and tackled McNaughton to the ground before he could fire again. The victim was taken immediately to the hospital. At first, the doctors thought he would survive. He was talking and conscious. The bullet had gone through his back, but he seemed, against the odds, fairly stable. Unfortunately, this was 1843, and medical treatment in 1843 mostly involved a lot of poking around with unwashed instruments and hoping for the best. The doctors couldn't locate the bullet. The bleeding didn't stop. Over the following days, the man's condition steadily worsened.
5 days later, he was dead.
The man who had been shot on a London street was Edward Drummond, Sir Robert Peel's private secretary, one of the most trusted officials in the British government. When police started questioning McNaughton, they expected the usual: a political radical, a hired gun, someone with a grievance and a plan. What they got instead was a man who looked lost. He wasn't defiant. He wasn't proud. He didn't seem to grasp the scale of what he'd done. When he finally spoke, it wasn't a confession in any normal sense. It was something closer to a plea. The Tories in my hometown forced me to do this. They follow me everywhere. I was forced to do it. The investigators sat with that for a moment, because that's not what a political assassin sounds like. That's what someone sounds like when they genuinely, sincerely believe the world is conspiring against them, and they have for quite some time. And then investigators uncovered something that made the case even stranger. McNaughton didn't know who Edward Drummond was. Not really. He had spent days watching the Prime Minister's residence. He had seen a well-dressed man coming and going, and somewhere along the way, he convinced himself that this man was Sir Robert Peel. He was wrong. He had shot the Prime Minister's secretary, a man he had never met, a man who had never wronged him, a man who, as far as anyone could tell, had absolutely no connection to McNaughton's life, his grievances, or the imaginary Tory conspiracy that had apparently been hunting him for years. He killed a complete stranger because of a persecution that existed nowhere inside his own head.
The trial was held here, at the Old Bailey, and it turned into, there's really no other word for it, a circus. The evidence, the shooting and the death, weren't in dispute. The only question was whether Daniel McNaughton understood the reality of what he had done. What they argued was that McNaughton couldn't help it. They brought in medical experts, doctors who examined McNaughton, and described a man living entirely within what they called morbid delusions. A man so detached from reality that he genuinely could not distinguish the world as it was from the world he believed existed. And in the dock, McNaughton didn't look like a killer. He looked terrified of enemies that weren't there, watching corners of the room as if expecting them to appear. The jury watched him, and they listened to the experts. The jury came back with a verdict that genuinely shocked the country. Not guilty, by reason of insanity. A man had shot and killed the Prime Minister's secretary in broad daylight on a London street and walked away without a noose. The public was outraged. Queen Victoria was more outraged. She was, by all accounts, furious that someone could commit a killing of that magnitude and not face execution. Royally, personally furious. Enough that she pushed the House of Lords to review the entire legal framework around criminal insanity. And that review produced something that's still with us today. The result was what became known as the McNaughton Rules, and in various forms they're still part of criminal law in courts around the world. The basic test, even now, comes down to two questions. Did the defendant understand what they were doing? And if they did they understand that it was wrong? If the answer to either is no, the law treats it differently from ordinary murder. It's a direct line from a confused woodturner standing on a London street, convinced an entire political party was hunting him, to legal standards used in courtrooms nearly 2 centuries later. As for McNaughton himself, he spent the rest of his life in Bethlehem Royal Hospital. Bedlam, as most people called it. Later, he was moved to Broadmoor. He died there, still convinced right to the end that shadowy figures were watching him from the corners of his cell. The conspiracy that started it all, the one that sent him to London, that put a pistol in his coat,
that ended Edward Drummond's life never existed anywhere except inside Daniel McNaughton's head. And yet, it changed the law. For everyone. Permanently. Right, that's the McNaughton case. Leave a comment if you've got thoughts. And honestly, if you ever catch yourself thinking, the Tories are definitely following me specifically, maybe just go and have a cup of tea instead. See you next time.